The story unfolds in the heart of a bustling city, where lives intertwine on a crowded bus, setting the stage for a powerful tale of kindness, courage, and consequences. Shayla, a resilient young woman navigating the challenges of pregnancy and daily life, unknowingly steps into a moment that will ripple far beyond her immediate world. When confronted by the unkindness of Jared, a successful yet arrogant executive, the stage is set for a clash of values and a test of humanity. As tension brews and passengers wrestle with their conscience, a quiet hero emerges, Ethan, a soldier whose moral courage sparks a chain of events that will change lives. From the heartwarming acts of solidarity among strangers to the humbling downfall of Jared, this story is a reflection of our shared responsibility to stand against injustice. Shayla and the scene. The late afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the city's crowded streets. The bus station, tucked within the heart of a mid-sized American city, buzzed with its typical cacophony, a symphony of idling engines, impatient chatter, and the occasional sharp honk from an irritated driver. The air was thick with the mingling scents of exhaust fumes and the first signs of spring, a faint floral undertone struggling to assert itself amidst the urban grit. Among the sea of faces, Shayla stood out, not because she demanded attention but because her quiet strength made her presence quietly resonate. At 28 years old, Shayla was 7 months pregnant, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly. Her dark, radiant complexion glowed faintly under the sunlight, and her braided hair was tied into a loose bun, emphasizing her natural beauty. Despite the obvious physical toll her pregnancy had taken, she radiated a determination that belied her exhaustion. Every day, Shayla's commute was a testament to her resilience. Working as a childcare assistant, she had learned to manage the demanding hours while caring for her growing child. She had refused to let pregnancy sideline her ambitions or independence, but the sacrifices were evident in the faint lines around her eyes and the way she shifted her weight frequently to ease the ache in her back. As she stood at the bus station, her mind wandered to the events of her day. The children's center where she worked had been unusually chaotic. A new group of kids had joined the program, bringing with them the energy and trepidation of adjusting to a new environment. Shayla smiled softly as she recalled a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin who had clung to her side all day. The child had sought comfort in Shayla's gentle presence, a connection that reminded Shayla of why she loved her work despite its many challenges. She had a gift for making people feel seen, a gift she hoped to pass on to her unborn child. Still, her thoughts weren't entirely serene. Lurking beneath her calm exterior was a web of doubts and fears about the future. Recently promoted at work, she felt both pride and pressure. Balancing her career with impending motherhood felt like walking a tightrope. With her partner working late-night shifts, Shayla knew many of the early challenges would fall squarely on her shoulders. Her hand moved in a circular motion over her belly, a gesture of reassurance as much for herself as for her child. The bus station was a microcosm of the city itself, a place where lives intersected briefly before diverging again. Among the crowd was Linda, a middle-aged woman Shayla had seen before. Linda stood a few feet away, her phone occupying her attention. Her attire, pencil skirt and blazer, suggested a corporate job. As if sensing Shayla's gaze, Linda looked up and smiled, her warm expression momentarily softening the bus station's harsh ambience. Shayla returned the smile, feeling a small wave of comfort. Linda's life, though unknown to Shayla, mirrored many of her struggles. A single mother with grown children, Linda had weathered storms of her own. She often thought of Shayla when she saw her at the station, silently cheering on the young mother-to-be. Her own journey had been marked by hard-won lessons about balancing work and family, and she hoped Shayla had the support she deserved. Nearby, a group of teenagers added a burst of energy to the scene, their laughter and banter contrasting sharply with the general weariness of the adults. One girl, her hair dyed a striking shade of blue, caught Shayla's eye and smiled. Shayla returned the gesture, finding a fleeting connection with the younger generation. The girl nudged her friend, whispering something that made them both glance shyly at Shayla. They reminded her of her younger self, spirited, hopeful, and unburdened by the responsibilities that now shaped her life. An elderly man, George, sat on a nearby bench, engrossed in a well-worn paperback. His wrinkled hands held the book carefully, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose as he read. The rhythmic turning of pages was a soothing counterpoint to the noise of the station. George had become a fixture at the bus stop, a quiet observer of the daily ebb and flow of life. He had seen Shayla before, always standing tall despite the physical strain of pregnancy, and he admired her tenacity. The diverse group of individuals at the station, a harried woman juggling a briefcase and coffee, the elderly man lost in his book, the animated teenagers, painted a vivid picture of urban life. Each had their own story, their own destination, Yet they shared this fleeting moment in time, brought together by the simple necessity of public transportation. Shayla adjusted the strap of her bag and shifted her weight once more as the distant rumble of an approaching bus reached her ears. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the press of bodies and the race for seats that awaited her. Her feet ached, and her back protested every movement, but her resolve remained steady. This was just another day in a long string of challenges, and she had learned to face them with grace and grit. Little did Shayla know, this ordinary day would take an extraordinary turn. The bus she boarded would not just carry her home, it would carry her into a moment that would test her resilience, reveal the hidden kindness and cruelty of strangers, and ripple far beyond the confines of its crowded interior. Jared and the conflict. The hiss of the bus brakes announced its arrival, sending a ripple of movement through the waiting crowd. Shayla stood back, allowing others to board first, her protective hand cradling her belly. Among the sea of passengers, one figure stood apart, not for any physical distinction but for the palpable cloud of irritation that seemed to surround him. Jared Thompson, a man in his mid-40s, was a study in contrasts. His expensive, slightly rumpled suit spoke of a life of privilege and high status, but the tension in his jaw and the impatient tapping of his polished shoe revealed a man whose day had not gone according to plan. Jared was a senior manager at a prestigious firm, someone used to control, efficiency, and the deference of others. But today, fate had dealt him an unwelcome hand. The breakdown of his luxury car had forced Jared into an unfamiliar world, the realm of public transportation. For a man who prided himself on his success and independence, standing among the everyday commuters felt like an affront to his carefully cultivated image. His crossed arms and scowling expression made it clear he would rather be anywhere else. He muttered under his breath, the complaints just loud enough to be heard by those nearest to him. "Damn mechanics," he grumbled, glancing at his expensive watch for the umpteenth time. "Can't believe this. A whole day wasted." The other passengers instinctively gave Jared a wide berth, sensing the foul mood emanating from him. His body language screamed, "Stay away," from the rigid set of his shoulders to the way he kept his briefcase planted firmly on the ground beside him, claiming more space than necessary. Jared's disdain for his current situation was palpable, his gaze darting dismissively over the crowd. For Jared, this was more than just an inconvenient commute. Beneath his irritation lay a simmering cauldron of resentment. His recent divorce had left him bitter and humiliated, a blow to the self-image he had worked tirelessly to project. Arguments over alimony payments, the loss of his family home, and the reality of being thrust back into the dating world had eroded his once unshakable confidence. The broken-down car was just the latest indignity in a series of events that felt like personal attacks. As passengers filed onto the bus, Jared pushed forward, determined to secure a seat. His impatience turned physical as he elbowed past George, the elderly man with the paperback, causing the older gentleman to stumble slightly. Linda, the middle-aged woman who had smiled at Shayla earlier, reached out to steady George, shooting Jared a disapproving look. Jared, oblivious or simply indifferent, marched forward and claimed a seat near the window. He placed his briefcase on the aisle seat beside him, effectively blocking anyone from sitting next to him. Shayla boarded the bus last, her movements careful and deliberate. The press of bodies and the close air of the bus were an immediate reminder of how exhausting these rides could be. She made her way down the aisle, her eyes scanning for an empty seat, but most were already occupied. Her gaze landed on Jared, whose briefcase claimed the last available spot. Gathering her courage, Shayla approached him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Could you please move your briefcase so I can sit?" Jared didn't look up. His fingers continued to fly across his phone screen, composing what appeared to be an angry email. After a long moment, he responded curtly, "No. Find somewhere else." The dismissal hit Shayla like a slap. She hesitated, unsure if she had misheard him. Her feet throbbed, and her back ached with the strain of standing, but she steadied herself. "There aren't any other seats," she said, her tone measured. She gestured to her belly as if to explain the obvious. "I really need to sit." Jared finally looked up, his expression one of annoyance rather than empathy. He shifted slightly, spreading his legs wider in an unconscious display of dominance. His voice, dripping with condescension, cut through the ambient noise of the bus. "Always expecting something for nothing," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. The words hung in the air, their implication clear. Shayla's chest tightened, a mix of anger and disbelief washing over her. She had encountered prejudice before, but it still stung each time, a sharp reminder of the biases that lurked beneath the surface of polite society. Jared turned back to his phone, effectively ending the interaction. Shayla stood frozen for a moment, torn between confronting him further and retreating. The cold indifference in his eyes made her decision for her. She turned away, gripping a handrail for balance as the bus lurched forward. The exchange didn't go unnoticed. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Some pointedly avoided looking at Shayla, their silence a shield against the guilt of inaction. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their disapproval evident but unspoken. Linda, the woman who had earlier steadied George, half rose from her seat as if to intervene but ultimately sat back down, uncertainty etched on her face. Even the boisterous teenagers at the back of the bus had fallen silent, their earlier chatter replaced by furtive whispers. Zoe, the girl with blue hair, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of anger and fascination. She leaned over to her friend and whispered, "Did you see that? What a jerk." Her friend nodded, both of them shooting daggers at Jared with their eyes. George, who had been quietly reading, lowered his book. His bushy eyebrows furrowed in disapproval as he observed Jared's behavior. He thought of his daughter, now grown, and felt a protective instinct flare within him. It was infuriating to see a pregnant woman treated with such blatant disrespect. Despite the growing discomfort among the passengers, no one spoke up. The unwritten rules of public transportation, mind your own business, avoid confrontation, held firm. The bus continued its journey, the tension simmering just below the surface. Shayla gripped the handrail tightly, her knuckles white with the effort. Her body ached, but it was the emotional weight of the encounter that pressed most heavily on her. Little did Jared or the other passengers know, this moment of cruelty would not go unanswered. The tension on the bus was about to reach a breaking point, and the arrival of an unexpected ally would set into motion a series of events that none of them could have anticipated. Escalation and public reaction. The bus moved through the city streets, its lurches and sways throwing Shayla slightly off balance as she stood gripping the handrail. Her swollen feet screamed for relief, her back throbbed with every bump in the road, and her mind reeled from the callousness of Jared's words. She had encountered prejudice before, but something about this moment, being so openly dismissed in a public space, cut deeper than she expected. Her hand instinctively rested on her belly as if shielding her unborn child from the harshness of the world. Around her, the air felt heavy with discomfort. The other passengers, each lost in their own lives moments earlier, were now acutely aware of the tension in the bus. Conversations that had been lively now fell to hushed murmurs, and the faint hum of the engine filled the oppressive silence. Every glance exchanged between passengers spoke of unspoken thoughts, frustration, disbelief, guilt, or perhaps even shame at their own inaction. Near the back of the bus, Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, couldn't tear her eyes away from Shayla. Her earlier excitement at the casual bustle of the commute had vanished, replaced by indignation. She whispered to her friend, "Can you believe him? Acting like she doesn't even matter." Her friend nodded, equally incensed but unsure of how to respond. They exchanged nervous looks, their youthful confidence wavering in the face of a real-world confrontation. Linda, the middle-aged woman who had briefly considered intervening, sat rigidly in her seat. Her mind raced, caught between her instincts to help and the ingrained caution of avoiding conflict. She'd worked with men like Jared before, arrogant, dismissive, and quick to wield power in ways that diminished others. Her heart ached for Shayla, who was clearly struggling, but fear held her back. What if she made the situation worse? What if Jared turned his venom on her? The internal conflict was a familiar one, and the weight of it pressed heavily on her chest. George, the elderly man with the paperback, had been a silent observer until now. He adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he placed his book on his lap. Decades ago, George had witnessed firsthand the struggles of the civil rights movement. He remembered the courage it took for people to stand up against injustice, to fight for equality in the face of overwhelming opposition. Watching Jared's blatant disrespect brought those memories rushing back, along with a sense of guilt that he hadn't done more in his youth. The anger bubbling within him now was a reflection of both the moment and the regret of past inaction. Even the young mother with the fussy toddler had noticed the unfolding tension. She bounced her child on her knee, trying to soothe them while casting furtive glances at Jared and Shayla. Her own exhaustion, etched into the lines of her face, gave her a deep empathy for Shayla's plight. She felt a growing frustration at the silence around her but hesitated to break it herself. Her child's needs had taught her to pick her battles carefully, but the injustice of the situation gnawed at her. Jared, meanwhile, seemed oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the growing unrest among his fellow passengers. He sat rigidly in his seat, his phone screen glowing faintly as his fingers tapped out messages with aggressive precision. Occasionally, he muttered under his breath, his words low but audible enough to reach those nearby. Always looking for handouts, he sneered, his disdain cutting through the charged atmosphere like a knife. Shayla closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath to steady herself. The ache in her back was nearly unbearable, and the swaying of the bus made it difficult to maintain her balance. She focused on her breathing, trying to push Jared's words out of her mind. This wasn't the first time she'd faced such unkindness, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But the weight of it, both physical and emotional, felt particularly heavy today. As the bus continued its journey, the tension became almost tangible. The passengers' discomfort transformed into a collective unease, a sense that something had to give. Zoe, emboldened by her growing anger, whispered to her friend, "Someone should say something." Her friend nodded but avoided eye contact with Jared, the unspoken fear of confrontation silencing them both. Linda shifted in her seat, her fingers gripping the strap of her purse tightly. She cast a glance toward Shayla, who stood just a few feet away, and then toward Jared, whose dismissive posture only added to her frustration. The memory of her own struggles as a single mother surfaced, fueling her growing resolve. She knew what it was like to be dismissed, to feel invisible in the face of others' entitlement. Her conscience screamed at her to act, but the fear of making herself a target kept her rooted in place. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, a low hum of shared disapproval. George, his book forgotten on his lap, leaned forward slightly, his weathered face etched with a mixture of anger and determination. He had spent too many years watching others take a stand without joining them. This time, he vowed, would be different. It was at this moment, as the collective unease reached its peak, that a quiet but commanding voice broke through the noise. "You think you've earned that seat?" The words were calm, measured, but carried an undercurrent of steel that immediately silenced the bus. Heads turned toward the source of the voice, and there, rising from his seat at the back of the bus, stood Ethan. Dressed in a crisp military uniform, his presence was impossible to ignore. His close-cropped hair and steady gaze exuded an air of authority and discipline, and his movements were deliberate as he made his way down the aisle. Ethan's appearance was like a gust of fresh air in the stifling tension of the bus. The passengers watched him with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation, their earlier hesitation giving way to a quiet hope that someone was finally stepping in. Even Jared, who had seemed untouchable moments earlier, stiffened slightly, his confidence faltering as Ethan approached. As Ethan came to a stop beside Jared's seat, the atmosphere on the bus shifted. The tension was no longer oppressive but electric, charged with the potential for change. In that moment, it was clear that this confrontation was about more than just a seat on a bus. It was about decency, respect, and the courage to stand up against injustice. The turning point, Ethan's intervention. The tension on the bus reached a palpable peak as Ethan, the young man in uniform, made his way deliberately down the aisle. The atmosphere seemed to shift with each step he took, the energy in the confined space no longer suffocating but charged with expectation. Passengers watched him with a mix of curiosity and silent admiration. His military uniform, sharp and pristine, spoke volumes about his discipline and strength, and his calm demeanor radiated authority. Ethan stopped beside Jared's seat, his posture relaxed yet commanding. He glanced briefly at Shayla, who was still gripping the handrail, her face etched with exhaustion and frustration. His gaze then shifted to Jared, who sat stiffly in his seat, his earlier bravado tempered by the imposing presence of the young soldier. Jared, sensing that he was being confronted, bristled visibly, his body language shifting from indifference to defensive. "You think you've earned that seat?" Ethan's voice was calm, steady, and yet it carried an unmistakable edge. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The other passengers, who had remained silent for so long, now leaned forward slightly, their attention fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Jared glanced up, his face flushing with irritation. "Excuse me," he snapped, his tone laced with incredulity. He was not used to being questioned, especially not in such a public setting. Ethan didn't flinch. "I asked," he repeated evenly, "what exactly you've done to deserve sitting there while she—" he gestured subtly toward Shayla, is left standing, struggling to hold herself up. Jared's eyes darted nervously around the bus, noting the stares of the other passengers. For the first time, he seemed to realize that the tide of opinion was against him. His earlier dismissal of Shayla, so easy to justify in his own mind, now felt exposed under the weight of collective scrutiny. "I don't owe her anything," Jared said finally, his voice defensive. He shifted in his seat, attempting to reclaim his air of authority. "I work hard for what I have. Why should I give up my comfort because she didn't plan her life better?" The words, intended to assert dominance, only deepened the silence on the bus. The passengers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outright disgust. Shayla stiffened, the sting of Jared's words rekindling her earlier hurt. Her hand rested protectively on her belly as if shielding her unborn child from the hostility. Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained composed. "You don't owe her anything," he echoed, his tone a mixture of disbelief and challenge. He took a small step closer to Jared, his presence looming larger despite his calm demeanor. "She's carrying more than you ever will. You think she hasn't worked hard? You think the life she's building doesn't deserve the smallest gesture of decency?" Jared opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan didn't give him the chance. "Real men stand up for others," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "They don't hide behind their own comfort or entitlement. They don't make excuses for being cruel." The words seemed to reverberate through the bus, their impact impossible to ignore. Jared's face reddened further, his earlier confidence unraveling under the weight of Ethan's quiet moral authority. He sputtered, searching for a retort, but his words came out jumbled and incoherent. The bravado he had relied on so heavily now seemed hollow in the face of Ethan's unwavering resolve. The other passengers began to stir, their earlier hesitation giving way to a collective sense of agreement. George, the elderly man with the paperback, nodded subtly, his weathered face set in a grim expression of approval. Linda straightened in her seat, her earlier fears dissolving into admiration for the young soldier. Even the teenagers at the back of the bus, who had been nervously whispering, now watched Ethan with a newfound respect. "You don't know what I've been through," Jared finally managed, his voice shaky but defiant. "You don't know my life." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "You're right," he said calmly. "I don't know your life. But I do know that the way you treat others says everything about the kind of person you are. And right now, you're showing all of us exactly who you are." Jared's mouth snapped shut, the weight of the judgment around him finally sinking in. He slumped back in his seat, his earlier defiance replaced by a reluctant silence. The other passengers, emboldened by Ethan's stand, began to murmur their own disapproval. The young mother with the toddler shook her head, her voice soft but audible, unbelievable. Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, whispered to her friend, "He's right. That guy's a total jerk." Linda, feeling her courage return, stood up and addressed Shayla directly. "Here," she said firmly, offering her seat. "You shouldn't be standing like this. Don't worry about him." Shayla hesitated, the kindness catching her off guard. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she murmured, "Thank you." She moved carefully toward Linda's seat, the relief evident in her every movement as she finally sat down. Ethan, satisfied that Shayla was no longer standing, turned his attention back to Jared. "Think about this," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. "What you did here today, what you said, it doesn't just affect her. It shows everyone here who you are. And it's not something they're going to forget." With that, Ethan stepped back, his presence no less commanding as he returned to his seat at the back of the bus. The silence that followed wasn't the oppressive kind that had preceded his intervention. It was reflective, laden with the weight of what had just transpired. Jared remained in his seat, his face pale and his posture deflated. For the first time, the man who had entered the bus with an air of superiority seemed small, his earlier confidence reduced to a flicker. Shayla, now seated and cradling her belly, let out a long, shaky breath. The tension in her body began to ease, and a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. The simple act of sitting felt monumental after the struggle of the last hour, but it was the solidarity of strangers, the quiet heroism of Ethan and the kindness of Linda that brought her a deep sense of relief. The bus rumbled on through the city streets, but the atmosphere inside had shifted. It was no longer a place of silent tension but one of quiet reflection. The passengers, once reluctant to act, now carried the weight of the moment, each of them changed in ways they couldn't yet fully understand. Passenger actions and the ripple effect. The atmosphere on the bus had shifted dramatically following Ethan's intervention. What had once been a silent and oppressive space now buzzed with a mix of reflection, solidarity, and subtle shifts in behavior. The passengers, who moments ago had been reluctant to act, were now finding small ways to express their humanity, each action a ripple in the larger story unfolding. Shayla sat in the seat Linda had offered her, finally able to take the weight off her aching feet. Her hand rested protectively on her belly as she exhaled deeply, her body visibly relaxing after the strain of standing. She glanced at Linda, her gratitude evident in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of sincerity that made Linda's decision to act feel even more significant. Linda smiled warmly, brushing off the thanks with a wave of her hand. "It's the least I could do," she replied. But in her heart, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. For years, she had struggled with the balance of standing up for what was right versus maintaining her own safety and comfort. Offering her seat to Shayla was a small gesture, but it felt monumental in the moment, a reminder that courage could be found in simple acts of kindness. At the back of the bus, Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, sat up straighter in her seat. She had been a quiet observer until now, unsure of how to contribute. But Ethan's courage had sparked something in her. She nudged her friend and whispered, "I should have said something earlier." "We all should have." Her friend nodded, her cheeks tinged with embarrassment. "Yeah. It's like, he just showed us what we should have done." Zoe reached into her backpack and pulled out a small portable charger. She leaned forward and offered it to Shayla. "Here," she said, her voice shy but determined. "Just in case your phone's dead or something." Shayla blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the gesture. A small smile broke across her face as she accepted the charger. "Thank you," she said again, her tone filled with warmth. Zoe returned to her seat, feeling a rush of pride that she had, in her own way, contributed to the moment. George, the elderly man who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. His voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of years. "Back in my day," he said, addressing no one in particular but capturing the attention of those nearby, "we fought for the right to be treated with respect. It wasn't easy, but we stood up for each other. What that young man did just now, that's what it takes to make a difference." His words carried a quiet authority, and the passengers near him nodded in agreement. George glanced at Shayla, his expression softening. "You've got a strength about you, young lady. Keep that spark alive. This world needs it." Shayla's smile widened, and she nodded in acknowledgement. The respect and encouragement in George's words felt like a balm, soothing the sting of Jared's earlier cruelty. Across the aisle, a construction worker in a dusty uniform rummaged through his lunchbox. He pulled out a bottle of water and leaned toward Shayla. "Here," he said gruffly, handing it to her. "You look like you've had a long day. Stay hydrated." Shayla accepted the bottle with a laugh that carried a note of relief. "I really appreciate it," she said, unscrewing the cap and taking a sip. The kindness from strangers was unexpected, but it filled her with a sense of hope. She felt less alone, buoyed by the small but significant gestures of those around her. Even the young mother with the toddler, who had been struggling to keep her child calm, found herself drawn into the collective mood. She caught Shayla's eye and smiled, bouncing her child on her knee. "You're doing amazing," she said softly. "I know how hard it is. If you ever need to vent or ask questions, I'd be happy to help. I've been there." Shayla's heart swelled at the offer. "Thank you," she replied, her voice full of emotion. "That means so much." Meanwhile, Jared sat in his seat, visibly shrinking under the weight of the disapproval surrounding him. His earlier bravado had evaporated, leaving behind a man who seemed acutely aware of his own isolation. He stared out the window, avoiding the gazes of his fellow passengers. The judgment in their eyes was unmistakable, and for the first time, Jared felt the consequences of his actions in a way he couldn't brush aside. The bus continued its journey, the hum of the engine punctuated by the occasional murmur of conversation. The passengers, once strangers, now felt a sense of connection, a shared understanding that they had witnessed something significant. The energy on the bus was no longer tense but contemplative, a quiet acknowledgement of the power of collective humanity. Ethan, sitting at the back of the bus, watched the scene unfold with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't intervened for recognition or praise, he had done it because it was the right thing to do. Seeing the ripple effect of his actions, the way one moment of courage had inspired others, reaffirmed his belief in the importance of standing up for what's right. As the bus approached its next stop, several passengers rose from their seats, preparing to disembark. George gave Shayla a nod and a small smile before stepping off the bus, his presence leaving an imprint on the moment. Zoe and her friend waved shyly at Shayla as they exited, their earlier apprehension replaced by a newfound confidence. Shayla sat quietly, her heart full despite the exhaustion of the day. The acts of kindness she had witnessed and received were small in the grand scheme of things, but they meant everything in that moment. They reminded her that even in a world where prejudice and cruelty existed, there were still people willing to stand up for others, to offer kindness without expecting anything in return. The bus rumbled on, carrying its passengers toward their destinations. But for those who remained, the journey had become more than just a ride home. It was a reminder that even in the smallest, most ordinary spaces, extraordinary acts of humanity could flourish. Jared's departure and the immediate aftermath. As the bus continued its route through the city, the atmosphere settled into an uneasy calm. The sharp tension that had hung over the passengers after Jared's confrontation with Ethan began to dissipate, replaced by quiet reflection. Yet the memory of the moment lingered, fresh and raw, in the minds of everyone aboard. Jared sat stiffly in his seat, his earlier bravado now entirely extinguished. The weight of the collective judgment from the other passengers bore down on him, making the air around him feel stifling. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed firmly out the window, avoiding eye contact with anyone. For a man who had prided himself on control and dominance, this moment of public humiliation was unbearable. The world outside the bus blurred as Jared's thoughts spiraled. He replayed the confrontation in his mind, each word from Ethan a fresh sting to his ego. Jared wasn't used to being called out, least of all in such a public way. He had spent years cultivating an image of success and authority, an image that felt irreparably cracked now. His attempts to justify his actions in his own mind felt hollow, the rationalizations unable to hold up against the quiet condemnation of those around him. Shayla, now seated and feeling more at ease, caught a glimpse of Jared's reflection in the window. He looked smaller than before, his rigid posture and sharp suit no longer commanding the presence they once had. She didn't feel triumph or satisfaction at his discomfort, only a deep sense of weariness. What Jared had said and done was just one more instance in a long line of challenges she had faced. Yet, thanks to the solidarity of the other passengers and Ethan's bold intervention, she felt less burdened by it. Ethan, seated at the back of the bus, kept his eyes trained on Jared. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered since the confrontation, but his vigilance spoke volumes. He had done what he could to address the situation, but he was still watching, ensuring that Shayla remained safe for the remainder of the journey. The quiet heroism in his actions hadn't gone unnoticed by the other passengers, who occasionally glanced his way with admiration. As the bus approached Jared's stop, the vehicle slowed, its brakes hissing softly as it pulled to the curb. Jared stiffened, clearly eager to make his exit and escape the weight of the moment. Without looking at anyone, he stood and grabbed his briefcase, his movements hurried and mechanical. The other passengers watched him silently, their gazes heavy with unspoken judgment. Jared's steps faltered slightly under the collective weight of their disapproval. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment, his hand gripping the pole for support. His head turned slightly, as if he might address the passengers or offer an apology. But the moment passed, and he quickly disembarked, stepping onto the sidewalk without a backward glance. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, and the bus pulled away, leaving him standing alone under the harsh glow of a streetlight. Inside the bus, the atmosphere shifted once again. Jared's departure felt like the release of a held breath. Some passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering anger. The oppressive weight of his presence was gone, but the memory of his actions remained fresh. Linda, still standing near Shayla's seat, let out a quiet sigh. "Well," she said softly, "good riddance." Her words, though understated, carried the sentiment of many on the bus. The young mother with the toddler nodded in agreement, her expression one of quiet vindication. George, the elderly man who had witnessed the entire incident, shook his head slowly. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low but clear, "it takes a moment like this to show someone the truth about themselves. Let's hope he learns something from it." Shayla offered a small smile, her gaze turning out the window. She wasn't sure if Jared would learn anything from the experience, but she hoped the collective stand taken by Ethan and the other passengers had at least planted a seed of awareness. The journey home had been far from ordinary, but it had reminded her of the strength found in community, even among strangers. The bus continued its route, the city lights casting fleeting patterns on the faces of the passengers. Conversations began to pick up again, tentative at first but growing in confidence as the tension dissipated. Some passengers shared their thoughts on the incident, while others reflected silently, their minds turning over what they had witnessed. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his gaze still alert but his expression softening. He wasn't the type to seek praise for his actions, but he couldn't ignore the subtle nods and glances of gratitude from the other passengers. He had done what he believed was right, and that was enough for him. For Shayla, the moments following Jared's departure brought a sense of peace. The support she had received from Linda, Ethan, and even the other passengers who had offered small gestures of kindness was a reminder that cruelty didn't always prevail. There were still good people in the world, people who cared enough to stand up when it mattered. As the bus rumbled on, the passengers settled into a new rhythm. The incident with Jared was over, but its impact lingered in the shared understanding among those who had witnessed it. It was a moment that had brought strangers together, however briefly, in a collective stand against injustice. Little did they know, for Jared, the bus ride was only the beginning of a far-reaching reckoning. The consequences of his actions would extend far beyond this single evening, rippling out into his personal and professional life in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Shayla's story and Ethan's role. As the bus continued its journey, Shayla sat quietly in her seat, her mind replaying the events of the evening. The initial sting of Jared's words had begun to fade, replaced by a mixture of gratitude and reflection. The kindness she had experienced in the aftermath, Linda offering her seat, Ethan standing up for her, and the supportive gestures from other passengers, had turned what could have been a wholly demoralizing experience into a reminder of resilience and solidarity. Shayla placed her hand gently on her belly, feeling the faint movements of her baby within. One day at a time, she whispered to herself, echoing the mantra she often used to steady her nerves when the challenges of life felt overwhelming. Tonight's events, though difficult, reminded her of the strength she carried, not just within herself but also within the community of strangers who had come to her aid. She thought back to her journey so far, a life filled with trials but also triumphs. Raised by a single mother who had worked tirelessly to provide for her, Shayla had learned early on the value of perseverance. Her mother's sacrifices had been the foundation of her own determination to succeed. Whether it was staying up late to finish her degree or balancing her work at the children's center with the demands of pregnancy, Shayla had faced each challenge head-on. Yet, tonight's encounter had stirred something deeper within her, a recognition of how often she had been forced to weather such moments alone. The casual dismissals, the quiet prejudice, and the subtle judgments that she had grown adept at navigating were a reality she hoped her child would never have to face. But seeing Ethan's courage and Linda's quiet support reminded her that she wasn't as alone as she sometimes felt. Ethan's actions, in particular, had left a profound impression on her. The way he had calmly but firmly confronted Jared had been both empowering and humbling. She had seen men like Jared before, people who wielded their privilege with careless cruelty. But Ethan's presence had been a counterbalance, a reminder that decency and strength could coexist. His words echoed in her mind, "Real men stand up for others." Shayla glanced toward the back of the bus, where Ethan sat, his expression calm but vigilant. He had returned to his seat after the confrontation, but his eyes occasionally flicked toward her, a silent assurance that he was still watching over her. The quiet dignity in his demeanor made her wonder about his own story. What had shaped him into the kind of person who would step forward when so many others hesitated? For Ethan, the evening had been a natural extension of his values. His military training had instilled in him a sense of responsibility, not just to his country but to the people around him. The discipline and courage he had developed during his service weren't limited to the battlefield. They were principles he carried into every aspect of his life. When he had seen Jared's blatant disregard for Shayla's dignity, stepping in had felt as instinctive as breathing. But Ethan also understood that courage wasn't always about grand gestures. It was about the small, everyday choices to do the right thing, even when it was uncomfortable. Watching Linda offer her seat to Shayla and seeing other passengers begin to show their support reassured him that the seeds of change could take root in even the most ordinary moments. As the bus approached Shayla's stop, Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction. He hadn't intervened for recognition or thanks, he had done it because it was the right thing to do. But seeing the way the other passengers had rallied around Shayla, offering her kindness in the wake of cruelty, gave him hope. It was a reminder that even in a world that often felt divided, people still had the capacity to come together in moments that mattered. When the bus slowed to a halt, Shayla began to gather her things. Her movements were slower now, deliberate and careful, as if the evening's events had drained her energy. As she stood, several passengers instinctively moved to assist her, a ripple effect of the collective empathy that Ethan's actions had inspired. Before stepping off the bus, Shayla turned to Ethan, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting his. "For everything." Ethan nodded, a small smile softening his otherwise serious expression. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "Anyone should have done the same." Shayla's lips curved into a faint smile. "Maybe," she said, "but you actually did." Their brief exchange carried an unspoken understanding, a shared recognition of the power of standing up for what was right. As Shayla stepped off the bus and onto the quiet sidewalk, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The challenges of her life hadn't disappeared, but the events of the evening had reminded her of the strength she carried and the goodness that still existed in the world. For Ethan, the encounter had reinforced his belief in the importance of action. He knew the bus ride would likely fade into memory for many of the passengers, but for Shayla, and even for Jared, it might linger as a turning point. As the bus pulled away, Ethan glanced out the window at Shayla's retreating figure, his resolve to continue living by his principles solidified. Inside the bus, the other passengers remained quiet, each reflecting on what they had witnessed. Linda, who had found her own moment of courage in offering her seat, felt a deep sense of pride. Zoe, The blue-haired teenager replayed the confrontation in her mind, vowing silently to be braver in the future. And George, the elderly man, smiled to himself, grateful that he had lived to see another example of people choosing kindness over indifference. The ripple effect of Ethan's actions was undeniable. It had inspired moments of kindness, shifted perspectives, and left an indelible mark on those who had witnessed it. But more importantly, it had given Shayla a sense of dignity and respect in a moment when she had felt most vulnerable, a gift that would stay with her far beyond this single bus ride. Jared's downfall and consequences. As the bus rumbled on without Jared, he walked briskly down the sidewalk, his mind a swirling storm of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. The public confrontation with Ethan had not just shattered his sense of control, it had laid bare the entitlement and prejudice he had spent years justifying to himself. Jared clutched his briefcase tightly, the gesture more about clinging to what little remained of his self-image than any practical need. He muttered under his breath as he walked, replaying the scene in his head. How dare he? Jared thought. Who does he think he is? But even as he fumed, a small, unwelcome voice in the back of his mind whispered that Ethan had been right. That voice was quickly silenced by the louder roar of his ego, which insisted that Jared was the victim, that the entire bus had turned against him unfairly. The consequences of the evening's events, however, would not be confined to Jared's thoughts. The confrontation, witnessed by a bus full of people, was about to ripple outward in ways he could never have anticipated. Unbeknownst to Jared, someone on the bus had captured the entire incident on video. The grainy footage, which showed Jared refusing to give up his seat to a pregnant woman and Ethan's calm yet powerful intervention, was already making its way through social media. By the time Jared arrived home, exhausted and irritable, the video had begun to gain traction. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times, accompanied by captions like, "This is what privilege looks like," and "Meet the man who thought his seat was more important than basic decency." Jared's face, once a symbol of success and authority in his professional circles, was now plastered across timelines and news feeds, associated with callousness and entitlement. The next morning, Jared awoke to a flood of notifications on his phone. Emails, text messages, and missed calls from colleagues, friends, and even acquaintances he hadn't spoken to in years. His stomach sank as he opened the first message, from a coworker. "Hey, Jared. You might want to check the news." Panicked, Jared opened his social media accounts. His notifications were in the hundreds, a mix of angry comments, mocking replies, and direct messages from strangers berating him for his behavior. Headlines like "Executive refuses seat to pregnant woman" and "Hero soldier confronts entitled commuter" dominated his feed. The video had gone viral, and Jared was at the center of it. At first, Jared tried to rationalize the situation. "It's just social media," he told himself. "It'll blow over in a day or two." But as the hours passed, the backlash only intensified. News outlets picked up the story, and the incident became a talking point on morning shows and online forums. Jared's name and face were now synonymous with entitlement and casual cruelty. The consequences began to seep into Jared's professional life as well. By midday, he received an email from the CEO of his company, Mr. Coleman, requesting an urgent meeting. Jared's heart pounded as he entered the sleek glass-walled office, his suit impeccably pressed but his confidence crumbling. Mr. Coleman wasted no time. "Jared," he began, his tone cold and measured, "we've always prided ourselves on maintaining a reputation of integrity and respect. What you've done here jeopardizes not just your standing but the company's image as well." Jared opened his mouth to defend himself, but Mr. Coleman held up a hand. "Let me stop you right there. This isn't just about what happened on that bus. Ethan, my son, was there. He saw the whole thing. And frankly, I'm ashamed to have someone like you representing this company." The mention of Ethan's name hit Jared like a freight train. He realized, too late, that the soldier who had confronted him was not just any passenger but the son of his boss. The sinking feeling in his stomach deepened as Mr. Coleman continued. "I've reviewed the footage, and I've spoken with HR, effective immediately. Your employment with this company is terminated. You'll be escorted to collect your belongings." Jared sat frozen, the words crashing over him like waves. Fired. His career, his meticulously cultivated image of success, was over in an instant. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, and now, with a single moment of cruelty, he had undone it all. As Jared left the office under the watchful eye of security, he felt the judgmental stares of his former colleagues following him. The whispers and murmurs were a sharp contrast to the respect he had once commanded in these halls. He was no longer Jared Thompson, the successful executive. He was Jared Thompson, the man who had become a viral cautionary tale. The fallout didn't end there. Within days, Jared's memberships in prestigious social clubs were quietly revoked. His favorite restaurant informed him that his reservation had been lost. Even his attempts to secure new employment were met with polite but firm rejections. The viral video had followed him everywhere, turning his name into a red flag for prospective employers. Jared's financial situation began to deteriorate rapidly. The luxurious lifestyle he had once enjoyed, complete with a high-end car, an upscale apartment, and expensive hobbies, became unsustainable without his six-figure salary. He sold his car to cover mounting bills and moved into a modest apartment, a far cry from the life he had taken for granted. In a cruel twist of irony, Jared found himself relying on the same public transportation system he had once derided. Each bus ride was an exercise in paranoia, his eyes darting around nervously, wondering if anyone recognized him. The man who had once commanded respect in boardrooms now sat quietly at the back of the bus, his presence unremarkable. But the real toll of Jared's actions wasn't just financial or professional, it was personal. The isolation he felt, the shame that followed him everywhere, was a constant reminder of the man he had been and the choices he had made. His fall from grace was complete, and the journey to redemption, if it was even possible, seemed insurmountable. For Jared, the bus ride that evening had been the beginning of a long and painful reckoning. And yet, in the depths of his despair, a faint glimmer of hope remained, the possibility of change. Whether he would seize that opportunity, however, remained to be seen. Months had passed since the fateful bus ride that had brought so many lives to an intersection. The city hummed along, its rhythm unbroken by the drama that had unfolded within the confines of a single bus. For Shayla, life had moved forward, marked by profound changes and a renewed sense of hope. Her baby had been born, a beautiful, healthy daughter she named Maya, a name that symbolized strength and resilience. One crisp autumn afternoon, Shayla found herself at the local community center. The warm, inviting space had become a sanctuary for her, a place where she could attend parenting classes and connect with other mothers. Maya, bundled in a soft pink blanket, dozed peacefully in her arms as Shayla chatted with another young mother about the joys and challenges of raising a newborn. As the conversation lulled, the door to the community center opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Dressed in civilian clothes but carrying the same air of quiet strength, Ethan entered the room. Shayla's heart skipped a beat as recognition dawned. She stood, carefully cradling Maya, and approached him. "Ethan," she called softly, her voice tinged with disbelief and gratitude. Ethan turned, his face lighting up with a warm smile as he recognized her. "Shayla," he replied, his tone friendly yet respectful. His eyes drifted to the baby in her arms, and his smile widened. "And who's this?" "This is Maya," Shayla said proudly, her voice full of emotion. "She's the reason I've been pushing through everything." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She's beautiful," he said sincerely. "And she's lucky to have a mother like you." The two stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the memories of the bus ride unspoken but present between them. Finally, Shayla broke the quiet. "I never got the chance to properly thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "What you did that night, it meant more than I can put into words. You didn't have to stand up for me, but you did. And because of you, I left that bus feeling seen, feeling like I mattered." Ethan shook his head slightly. "You don't have to thank me," he said, echoing his words from that night. "Anyone should have done the same." "Maybe," Shayla said, her eyes meeting his. "But not everyone does. And that's what makes it matter." Ethan's smile was tinged with humility as he replied, "I'm just glad I could help." As they continued to talk, Shayla shared how the kindness she had experienced that night had stayed with her, carrying her through the final months of her pregnancy. She told Ethan about the other passengers, the small acts of solidarity that had restored her faith in people, and how those moments had inspired her to look for ways to give back. She had started volunteering at the community center, helping other mothers navigate the challenges of pregnancy and early parenthood. Ethan, in turn, shared how the bus ride had stayed with him as well. He spoke about the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how small the stage. "Moments like that," he said, "remind us of who we want to be, not just as individuals, but as a society." Their conversation turned to Jared, whose life had taken a very different trajectory. Shayla hesitated before asking, "Do you know what happened to him?" Ethan's expression turned serious. "I do," he said. "My father, the CEO of the company where Jared worked, fired him after seeing the video. It wasn't just about what happened that night. It turns out there were years of complaints about his behavior. The bus ride was just the final straw." Shayla nodded slowly, processing the information. "Do you think he'll ever change?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and hope. Ethan shrugged, his gaze thoughtful. "That's up to him," he said. "Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to realize you need to change. Whether he chooses to learn from it or not is his decision." Shayla looked down at Maya, who had begun to stir in her arms. "I hope he does," she said quietly. "Not for his sake, but for the people he might interact with in the future. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect." Ethan nodded in agreement. "And it's people like you who remind the world of that," he said. "You carry so much strength, Shayla. Don't ever forget that." As their conversation came to a natural close, Shayla extended her hand. "Thank you again," she said, her grip firm yet gentle. "For everything." Ethan shook her hand, his smile genuine. "You've got this," he said simply, nodding toward Maya. "And if the world ever forgets what kindness looks like, remind them." With that, Ethan turned to leave, his presence as steady and reassuring as ever. Shayla watched him go, a deep sense of closure settling over her. The events of that night on the bus had been a turning point, not just for her but for everyone involved. They had shown her the power of solidarity, the courage of standing up for what's right, and the importance of carrying those lessons forward. As Shayla left the community center, the autumn breeze brushing against her face, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Maya stirred in her arms, letting out a soft coo, and Shayla smiled. The world was far from perfect, but she knew now that even small acts of kindness could make it better. The bus ride that had started as an ordinary commute had transformed into a story of humanity and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of cruelty, courage and compassion could prevail. And as Shayla walked toward her future, she carried with her not just the weight of her struggles but also the strength of a community that had, for one night, come together to do what was right.